everybody, and welcome back to the screencast. This is the second episode in the Web Application Development with Symfony 5 series. In the first, we installed Symfony 5 using the website skeleton recipe with the composer create project command, and we also installed and set up Laravel Homestead as our virtual development environment. In fact, the very last thing we did in the previous episode was to run Vagrant up, and we saw this, the wonderful, the marvelous default welcome to Symfony page. And I'm just going to refresh it just a few more times. Anyway, in this episode, we're going to continue on to take a look at routes and controllers. So if you didn't catch the first episode, or you just want to follow along or understand how we got to this point, please go back and have a look at episode 1. We'll leave a link on the page. Now, one thing to mention at this point is that I'll be using a mix of Vim and PHP Storm throughout this series to add and edit code. If you're following along, you can, of course, use whichever IDE or text editor you prefer. I'm just going to try and point out the things that PHP Storm does for me in the background that other IDEs and or text editors may not do, so that you're aware that you may have to add something manually, such as class imports. We'll see that a little bit later on. So before we take a look at routes and controllers, there are a couple of things I'd like to review first. What we did in the first episode, and we'll continue to do throughout this series, is to monitor the files that are added and or removed, or files that are changed as a result of the commands we run in the terminal. And for that, we're using git and specifically the git status command. So let's switch to the terminal and run git status. Now we can see that our composer files and our Symfony log file, the file that keeps track of the Symfony Flex recipes we've installed, changed as a result of installing Laravel Homestead. Now, we can see this more clearly if we run git diff followed by the file name. So we'll commit those files in a moment. And as a result of opening the project in PHP Storm, we now have a .idea directory. Now, whether or not you want to share your IDE configuration along with your application source code is very much dependent on your particular circumstances, but if you do, there's guidance about how to accomplish that on the JetBrains support website. We're going to ignore it, and we'll do that in a moment. Also, as a result of running the homestead make command in the previous episode, we have a homestead configuration file, which we looked at briefly last time, and a Vagrant file. Now, the role of the Vagrant file is to describe the type of virtual machine to build and how to provision it. And as I mentioned before, if you're working with a team of developers, you'll want to add both of these files, the Vagrant file and the Homestead configuration file, to Git. Now, the .vagrant directory here, on the other hand, which was created as a result of running Vagrant up, typically wouldn't be added to source control. So let's open the gitignore file in Vim, and we'll add .vagrant / and .idea / to the bottom of the file. Now, if we save that, we can run git status, and that's all looking good. And then we'll add everything to Git, and we'll commit our changes. Excellent. Let's check they're on a clean working tree with git status, and we are. Now, talking of Laravel Homestead, we should take a very quick look at our shiny new virtual machine. Now, we ran Vagrant up at the end of the last episode, so assuming our virtual machine is running, we should be able to run Vagrant SSH in the terminal and have a look around. Now, if we print the working directory by typing pwd, we can see that we've landed in the home /vagrant directory. but then our project files aren't here. Instead, they're actually located inside a directory called code, which we can see here. Let's change directory. So we'll cd into the code directory and we'll type ls-la, and yes, we see all our project files. Now the reason that they're here is if we take a quick look at our Homestead configuration file, we can see this folder mapping entry where we have this directory on our host machine mapped to this directory here on our virtual machine. So that's all good. Our project files are where we expect them to be. Now with all that done, let's get on to routes and controllers. Now at the moment, we still have the default Welcome to Symfony landing page. Let's just refresh it a couple of more times. And that's because, as the message at the top of the screen says, we haven't set a homepage URL and debug mode is enabled, which is a friendly way of saying we haven't any routes. So what is a route? Well, in simple terms, a route is a mapping between a HTTP request and the code in your application that will execute and ultimately return a HTTP response. We take a look inside the config directory, and at the routes.yaml file, we can see the simplest example of a route. Let's uncomment it so we can see it a bit more clearly. Now this was created for us during the Symfony installation process. I have not added this. We can see we have an entry called index, which maps the / path to a controller class called default controller. Now this is in the app / controller namespace, and furthermore, that when our application receives a HTTP request, that matches this route to the index method of the default controller class. So why app and why controller? Well, if we take a look at our composer.json file and at the auto-load entry, we can see our project auto-load configuration is using the PSR4 autoloader standard, and you can check out the PHP Framework Interop Group website for more information about the PSR4 standard. But essentially, we can see that this configuration in composer.json will register a PSR4 autoloader with the app namespace, and that our configuration maps that app namespace to the src directory in the root of our project. So if we take a look at the src directory, we can see that Symfony has created some directories for us, one of which is the controller directory, which at the moment contains a .gitignore file, just so the empty directory can be added to source control. But we have no default controller class, so actually, now that we've uncommented the root in the routes.yaml file in the config directory, if we just refresh the page, we should get an exception, which we do. A 500 internal server error, which helpfully tells us what we already know, that there's no default controller. So let's go ahead and create the default controller class. We'll create a new class called default controller in the controller directory of our project, and we'll need to set the namespace to app/controller. Now, the function of a controller is to receive a HTTP request and to return a HTTP response. That's it. Now let's go ahead and add a public function named index. Remember, we said that our root would call a method named index on the default controller. And let's simply return a HTTP response. Now, a feature of PHP Storm is that it enables me to autocomplete on the class name, and that when I hit return, it'll add the appropriate use keyword under the namespace. In short, as long as you bring into scope the Symfony component HTTP Foundation response class, you're good to go. Now, the response class constructor takes 3 arguments. The first is the content of the response, which is typically a string. You can actually return null to return a response with an empty body. The content parameter is a nullable type, a feature which was added in PHP 7.1, and that enables you to return the specified type or null, so string or null can be passed or returned for that matter. Have a look at the nullable types documentation on the php.net website for that. Now, the second and third parameters are optional. The second is the HTTP status code to return, and this defaults to 200. And the third parameter is for HTTP header and defaults to an empty array. So let's return some HTML. We'll create some very, very basic HTML here. HTML, and inside there we'll have a body tag, and we'll add a p tag, and we will say hello world. Now, if we refresh the page in our browser, we should see hello world, and hooray, we do. Now, defining your roots in roots.yaml is just one approach, and in fact you can create roots per environment, so roots for dev, roots for stage, roots for prod, whatever environments you have. Now, Symfony looks for and will load the roots defined in any YAML files. No matter how they're named, it's just the extension that's important. They have to be, or they have to have the .yaml extension. It will look for and load any roots defined in YAML files in a directory that has the same name as the current environment name inside the config/roots directory. So let's have a look at an example. If we have a look in config and roots, and in the dev directory inside there, we'll see 2 YAML files, framework.yaml, as I said, the extension is important, and web_profiler.yaml. Now, all of the roots in both of these files will be only loaded when the environment is dev. Now, in addition, Symfony will also load the roots defined in any YAML files. Again, file name is not important, just the file extension inside the config/roots directory itself. Now, you can also define your roots in PHP if you prefer, or XML. If you want to do them in PHP, you would create a file called roots.php inside the config directory. Now, you can check the Symfony documentation on how to do that if that's something that interests you. As I say, this is just one approach, and we'll see another approach a bit later. So we have our first root and we have our first controller. It's probably the simplest example of how Symfony maps a HTTP request to code that will produce a HTTP response. But of course, in the real world, things aren't so simple. So let's delete our default controller and have a look at another way of creating our controller, and also look at introducing a Twig template file. Now, Twig is, of course, the templating engine that Symfony uses. Now, in our virtual machine, inside the code directory we saw earlier, we can run Symfony console commands with php bin/console. And one of the bundles that was installed for us as a dev dependency, because we use the website skeleton recipe, is the maker bundle. Now, the maker bundle supersedes the Sensio generator bundle, if you're familiar with that. And essentially the maker bundle, well, it makes things. If we run php bin/console list make, we'll see a list of things that the maker bundle can make for us. And there's the make controller command. Now, this make controller command will create a controller for us. It also takes one argument, the name of the controller we want to create, and has an option which enables us to control whether or not a template is created along with the controller class. If we have a look at the help for the make controller command by running php bin /console make controller -- help, we can see the controller class argument. And here's another of my favorite Symfony features. Just look at that, the example controller class name. Isn't that wonderful? Let's just run it again and see what we get. Brilliant. I could do this all day. It's just, again, another feature that makes working with Symfony just that little bit more fun. And here we can see in the help the --no template option. So let's go ahead and run the command without generating a template at first and see what we get. So php bin /console make controller, and remember we want to call our controller default controller, and we're going to add the --no template option. Now the Symfony Maker bundle knows where to create the file, and we can see it's created it for us in the src /controller directory. Perfect. Now let's take a look at what the command has created for us. Now the first thing to notice is that default controller is extending the abstract controller class from the Symfony framework bundle. So we can utilize methods that we inherit from the parent class and do things such as call this JSON to return a JSON response, or this render to render a twig template, as we'll see in a few moments. Now the other thing to note is that we have a root annotation here, which is part of Symfony's routing component. And this is the other approach to creating roots, and in fact it's the way Symfony recommends in the documentation. The neat thing about this approach is the proximity of your root configuration to your controller code. And what's nice about the other approach that we saw earlier is that your roots are all located in one directory, the config directory. Now, whatever pros and cons you can think of for each approach, it ultimately doesn't matter which you choose, as each provides the same features and performance. You can even use a combination of both approaches if you so wish. Now, as things stand at the moment, we have one root defined in our routes.yaml file, which handles the path /, and one root defined in our default controller, which handles the /default path. Now, both of these paths are mapped to the same controller code and essentially the same method in default controller. So let's take a look at that in action. If we go back to the browser, and given that we deleted the old default controller and that we're now using the new default controller generated for us by the Maker bundle, we should see a JSON response when we refresh the page, which we do. Now this is because the root defined in routes.yaml is mapping / to the index method of our default controller. Likewise, if we now append / default to the URL, we should see the same JSON response, which we do. And this is because the root annotation in our default controller is mapping that path to the same index method, so we get exactly the same response. So let's get rid of our root definition in routes.yaml. Now the consequence of doing this is that if we now visit the home page in our browser, we're back to the default Welcome to Symfony page, and we'll just refresh it once this time. I'll stop doing that. But if we change the annotation in default controller, we should see our JSON response again, and we do. That's all fine, but what about if we want to return some HTML? Well, Let's go ahead and delete our default controller again and recreate it with the maker bundle. But this time, let's have the maker bundle create a twig template for us. So back in our virtual machine, let's run php bin/console make:\controller default controller. Now we can see that two files have been created for us. We have the default controller and we have the index.html.twig template file. Let's take a look at the new default controller. First things first, we'll need to set the root back to /. Now the code generated for us this time is slightly different than before, and this is because we didn't pass that --no--template option, and the maker bundle has generated a template file for us. So we can see that we are not calling and returning a JSON response by calling the JSON method of the parent abstract controller class, but this time we're calling the render method. And this render method takes 3 arguments. Now the first is the name of the view or template that's going to be called. And the second 2 arguments are optional. The second is an optional keyed array of data to pass through to the view. And the third argument is a HTTP Foundation response object. Now the render method will instantiate a response object for us, but if you want to instantiate it yourself and do stuff before passing it into the render method, you can. Now the other file that the maker bundle created for us is the index.html.twig file, and this was created in the templates/default directory. Now we can see that it extends the base.html.twig file and that we get some inline styles. That's nice. And we can also see that the variable we're passing in from the default controller will be rendered here within the surrounding HTML markup. Let's take a look at what this looks like in the browser. And there we go. We have our first HTML page. And wonderful it is. Well, I think we'll wrap things up for this episode. I hope it's been useful, and there's obviously so much more to routing with regards to pattern matching and all sorts of things you can do, and there's so much more to controller classes, but we'll get to all of that in future episodes. Next time we'll be continuing to see what the maker bundle can do for us. We'll be looking at the security component and adding a user registration form and user login form. As always, thanks for watching and see you next time.